So we've got Brother James on the channel with us today, and we're going to do a little bit of talking about Passover and circumcision. One of those, I guess it can be a hot topic.
Mm-hmm.
But before we begin, though, Brother James, you and I have talked a little bit through Messenger, and I think we have somewhat of a similar background in how we came into this faith. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and how you arrived at where you're at right now in your life as far as spiritually.
The short version is I was born and raised in Texas, in the Panhandle, and we were raised in the conservative branch of the Church of Christ. That's the branch that says no musical instruments in church at all, because in the New Testament they weren't playing guitars and playing organs and stuff. They were singing psalms and singing. So that's what we did. Um, as a young man, I guess it was around 2003. I just decided to read the Bible for myself, and just see what does it actually say what I was taught, because the Church of Christ teaches preterism, so like
Yes.
all prophecy has been fulfilled. We're basically in the kingdom.
Yeah.
And I came upon a website that was talking about Daniel and the beasts and Revelation 13 and all this stuff, and it just blew my mind. I was like, what? So I read my Bible cover to cover, and it's just like anybody else that's gone on this journey. You see these pesky words like forever and perpetually and throughout your generations associated with the Sabbath and the feasts and the covenants even, and it's hard to get around it, So like around 2003 is when I started to really unpack that. 2005, I decided to actually start doing it. So 2005 was the first time I kept the Sabbath, first time I kept Passover. Did that for a couple of years there in Texas, and then I met my wife. She's a native Pennsylvanian. In '05, we had a fellowship in Lubbock. I think it was called Temple Mount Moriah. We were a really interesting bunch. It was founded by basically a former Pentecostal family, and we had former Catholics, former Baptists. I mean, former whatever. They were in the building. And so we did it there twice. So that was when we did the big corporate, the traditional Jewish style Seder, with all the stuff,
Mhm.
and I'll never forget it. There was a gentleman I was sitting next to. I didn't know him because he was from like the wider community, not necessarily from the fellowship, but they do the whole thing where they talk about, you're going to do the horseradish, right? And horseradish is supposed to represent the bitterness of sin because, horseradish was considered traditionally, is, I guess, in the Seders to be a bitter herb. And the guy next to him, he just puts it on his matzah and he's just like, oh, I love this stuff. This is great. This is the favorite part of the whole thing. And I'm sitting here thinking like, this is supposed to represent sin. And you're just like reveling in it. It was just a weird
Mhm.
mental thing. But yeah, when I moved out to Pennsylvania, um, ever since then, we haven't done the traditional Jewish Seder. We've just done, bare bones Exodus 12,
Sure.
just what's in the text and nothing more. When you do Passover, you
Yeah.
really understand
Yeah.
Calvary. You think you understand Calvary before, but you don't really understand it until you actually walk
Yeah.
in his footsteps. So
Yeah. Amen. So in '07, when you started doing Passover there in Pennsylvania, was it with another group, Sacred Name or Torah group, or was it just with your family?
up until last year, we've always done it with just our family.
Okay.
We would just hang out in the house, and we would we we take it literally. We'll make sure we have shoes on our feet. I tell the kids now, this isn't something where we're going to sit and take all night. It says to eat it in haste. And I realize we're
Mhm.
not looking at a literal exodus on our doorsteps tonight. So
Sure. Sure.
but just to honor the spirit of it. And
Yeah.
I'll even have a staff in my hand. Just to
Yeah.
kind of really live it. And
I
um,
mean,
but yeah, last year was when we kept it with another family for the first time, and I think
mhm.
going forward we're probably going to do that in the future.
Tell me a little bit about your background or kind of association with some sacred name groups. That's kind of how I came into all of this back in the late
Hmm.
90s. I married my wife in 98 and started studying with her dad in 97. And at that time, her father, Arnold Bowen, and then a good friend of his, Jerry Kirk, down here in Georgia, they were like the spearhead of the sacred name movement, kind of like Jacob O'Meara was in Bethel, Pennsylvania,
Mhm.
back in probably the 70s and 80s. And I got the Sacred Name Broadcaster from 1998 till probably, man, I probably got it until like 2008. And I would
Mhm.
comb through that thing every time it was sent to me. And I learned so much from Elder Jacob O'Meara, very, very wise and humble, righteous man in the faith. I have a good friend of mine that actually was a member of the Assemblies of Yahweh in Bethel for about 4 years.
Mhm.
So I learned a lot from those brothers. So tell us a little bit about your background with all of that.
I wasn't a sacred namer until I moved out here. Like I had no idea, you know. I
Uh-huh.
just read my Bible, and I didn't. At that point, I was still kind of early in the walk, so I wasn't digging down and looking at how do we pronounce the tetragrammaton and all that kind of stuff. But
Sure.
when I met my wife, she and her family had actually attended the Assemblies of Yahweh for several years.
Hmm.
With Jacob O'Meara and his family, and they had stopped attending by the time I met her, but we actually attended for about a year and a half after we got married, just because I wanted to kind of see, I kind of wanted to kind of sit under that for a minute to kind of see, what it was about, and
Sure.
I came away with some good friendships. A couple sons of
Yeah.
his son Jake Meyer
Yeah.
has a congregation out in Bethel, Yahweh's
Yeah.
Brethren Assembly.
Hmm.
His son Solomon is a friend of mine, and yeah, Jake and Solomon, they're just. I never met Jacob O'Meara. He passed away before I ever had a chance to meet him, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But yeah, the sacred name thing. I mean, it's where I'm at here in Pennsylvania. Um, it's definitely a strong influence. If you bump into somebody that's not attending Bethel, there's a chance that maybe they did at some point in the past. you know, so
Mm-hmm.
we're kind of peppered all out throughout the region here.
Do you fellowship with an assembly now, or do you just have home fellowship on Sabbath? How do you do that?
Um, it's we have like multiple layers. We have a local home fellowship that's basically two or three core families that attend regularly, and then other families will just kind of come in, on a Sabbath as they're able, assuming they're not sick or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, we have a more regional get together once a month. There's a gentleman that owns some property, and he has a really nice setup, and multiple home fellowships will get there together once a month. We've got people um, from up towards State College all the way down towards Harrisburg. When we have the monthly thing, we've got people coming out as far as Lancaster. So that's
Wow.
within probably 2.5 mile radius.
Hmm.
And it's really been a blessing to kind of see. I mean, you've seen this over the years. Our favorite
Yeah.
thing to do in this Torah thing is to divide over doctrine, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's like our pastime. It's like baseball to us, so it's really encouraging to see all of these different home fellowships, and they all have a different unique flavor. But it's encouraging to see us all kind of starting to come together and kind of like, let's just get over that kind of stuff. Let's just
Yeah.
unite in bonds of Messiah. Let's just
Yeah.
really dig in and focus on this body thing.
Yeah,
um,
man. Yeah.
yeah.
I tell my I tell the people that I congregate with, where I'm a teaching elder there, that if somebody believes in the Creator and His Messiah, the Holy Scriptures, and they will say, "Yeah, we believe that we're supposed to keep the commandments, and I'm doing the best at the level that I'm at," then we should consider them a brother or a sister. And you're going to have people that you can get into the intricacies of how to keep certain commandments, and people are going to differ on that, with
Hmm.
calendars or the pronunciation of the name, or how to obey this law exactly or that law exactly. And all of that, I think, are gray areas where we should still have brotherly fellowship. There's certain places where we have to draw the line, but people in the Torah observant community draw the line, I think, way too much.
Yep.
And want to call people heretics if they don't keep the exact same calendar they do, or don't
Mhm.
pronounce the sacred name exactly like I do. And I kind of got tired of that a while back. But I am thankful. I am thankful for learning from men like Arnold Bowen and Jacob O'Meara. I learned a lot of the strictness of the Torah, and I'm thankful for that. We do walk in our family. We walk in the Torah. We're not perfect in the Torah, but we walk in the Torah and we take it seriously. the things that Yahweh allows, we we're liberal on in that case, but the things that Yahweh disallows, we're very, very strict on those because we
Hmm.
want to love our Creator, right? That's how you love Him, to keep His commandments. And I
Yep.
kind of get that same flair from you, just being friends with you on Facebook now for a few years. I think I get that same vibe from you that I feel like you're more serious about the commandments than, maybe some other people that I've ran into over the years.
I mean, I went through the phase where most people, do, where it becomes like a knowledge thing, it becomes a pursuit of knowledge, and I went through the thing where, like, um, much to my wife's chagrin, I would stay up all night sometimes trying to get to the bottom of what happened in Genesis 6, you know, like
Yeah,
the Nephilim and all that stuff,
yeah,
and it's
yeah,
like after a while you realize, that's useful information. I mean, there's something to
yeah,
it, but you can't walk it.
yeah,
I can't walk the knowledge of the Nephilim. I can't walk, things like that. But I can walk his commandments. I can walk his Shabbats. I can walk his Moedim. I
yes,
can walk the
yes,
brotherly love. And
yes,
so, over the years, I really decided to kind of focus on how can I live this,
yes,
and really trying to be submissive to the Father in that, because, like you said, it is all about loving Him. We can
yeah,
understand as humans, we have the idea of love language,
yeah,
and why can't we acknowledge that the Father has a love language? He told us plainly, you know, and
yeah,
yeah, it's just so much more rewarding, and I've just come to really think that if a person really hunkers down and we really get a good grasp of where we stand in the covenants, because it all goes back to the covenants and
yes,
what that looks like on the ground day to day. And, once we really can dig, put down deep roots in the covenants,
mhm,
if we want to start looking at these other things like the Nephilim and all the, some of the, and I don't mean to, cause controversy, but some of the apocryphal books and things, people get really focused on that stuff,
sure,
and
sure,
if a person can find balance where they have the deep root in the covenant, then at that point, I think it's a healthy thing to start looking at maybe some of these other issues because they are connected. But the problem
yeah,
is that too many of us in the pursuit of knowledge, we go looking at these other things before we have the deep roots in the covenants. And I've seen people over the years, they just get sucked into this stuff, and they forget about why we're doing it,
yeah,
and
yeah.
that's just really, it grieves me. I'm sure it grieves you too, knowing you, like I do. You see it too.
Well, you get to a point, where Matthew 5:19 is one of my favorite verses where Yeshua says, "Therefore," based on what I just said, "whoever breaks the least of these commandments and teaches men to do so will be called least in the kingdom. But if you practice and teach these commandments, you'll be called great in the kingdom. For unless your righteousness exceeds or surpasses the scribes and Pharisees, you won't enter the kingdom." So, what we can control is the keeping of the commandments. I can't control what the government's doing. I can't control
Right.
whether I get Genesis 6 exactly right in my head or not, which I have a belief on that, but I can't, that's not
Hmm.
something I can work out with my hands and my feet. But the commandments I can. And so I've devoted, I'll be 42 years old here just a couple months. And I've purposed in my heart and kind of sworn oath to Yahweh that for the rest of my life, my primary study and goal will be like Ezra in Ezra chapter 7, who purposed in his heart, he purposed his heart to study the Torah, to practice it, and then to teach it in Israel. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm teaching now through the book of Exodus. And it's so exciting because it's practical and you find things that maybe you didn't understand before. You can apply them to your life or the life of your marriage or your family life with your children and how you act and conduct yourself in a fallen world. And it's beautiful because the more you do that, I tell people, the more you love Yahweh. I said, the only way to love Yahweh is to keep His commandments, but we can love Yahweh more as we grow and understand better in the commandments and we show Him more love. It's just like, between a husband and a wife, the longer you're married, you find out what pleases your wife, what makes your wife happy, and you try to do that towards her so that she can live a
Hmm.
peaceful and joyous life. You love her more. It's the same thing with our Creator. And so sounds like me and you are on the same page on all of that.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your stance on that. I mean, like the whole Ezra thing. I mean, I can relate to that. Um, because I mean, when you look at like, and just to frame it in where we're looking at in society now, you've got this whole theme of revival going around now, and when you look at revivals in the Bible, it's Hezekiah, it's them finding the book of the law, and say, oh, wow,
Amen.
this is what's missing. Let's get back to this and let's live it. It's Josiah doing the same thing. Like, that's the pattern of revival, and it ultimately leads to restoration. Well, what are we
Yes.
restoring? The ancient paths, right? That's the whole
Yes.
thing. And so, when we look at Jude talking about, earnestly contending for the faith once and for all delivered to the saints,
Yes.
that's something primitive from when he said it. That's something earlier than when it's not something that we have now, And so
Yes.
getting back to just that pure, that water of the word, that root that's just always been there. Abraham kept the father's commandments, laws, statutes, and ordinances. We don't really know
Amen.
what that looked like to him day to day, but he was doing something in regards to his faith, and it pleased the Father. And we're,
Yeah.
we're supposed to be sons of Abraham by faith, right? So,
Yes.
I
Yes.
mean, yeah. So I really appreciate that. I really there's a I mean, you've seen it in the Hebrew Roots Tour thing over the years, I'm sure too. It's like we tend to we're almost going Gnostic, you
Mm.
know. We
Mm-hmm.
like we tend to look at these things that we see in black and white in the text, and we look for like this really deep, profound spiritual meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a deep, profound spiritual meaning to a lot of it, but I think the pursuit of that has caused people to miss the literal. Like,
Mm. Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
it's just, yeah, I really like the idea of just getting back to just the nuts and bolts basic. What does
Yeah.
this look like day to day? How do I teach it to my kids? How do I explain this faith to people who ask about it? Because eventually you look like a weirdo, to the
Yeah.
world around us. You
Yeah.
know, it's foolishness to the world what we do.
Yeah.
And but yet it's a badge of honor. It's like we're ambassadors of Father's kingdom. We get to show the world His heart by walking out His ways. And there's a
Amen.
real
Amen.
honor and a privilege when you submit into that calling and you just allow it to become who you are. And I see that in you, and I really appreciate that.
Mm.
We're basically the same age. I'm 41, so
Cool.
it's
Cool. Yeah.
yeah, so it's really neat to see somebody. You get it, and like I wrestle with this because when I read the scriptures, I see elders. That word elder means somebody older, right?
Yeah.
And like I've had to come to grips with the fact that like we almost have to think differently now because we've been so disconnected from
Yeah.
the original path of discipleship, as established by the Messiah and his disciples and whatnot. Back then, an elder, being biologically a gray bearded grandpa or whatever, that's who
Yes.
you would go to. But now we're so disconnected from that. I'm looking at
Yes.
guys as young as you as elders because
Yeah.
we're talking elders in the faith,
Sure.
not necessarily
Sure.
by age, it's by experience. You've been walking this
Yeah.
longer than I have.
Yeah.
So in,
Yeah.
in that regards, you're an elder.
So that was a good intro. Let's get into Passover. This is
All right.
what, yeah, this is what made me want to have you on the channel, brother, because you're doing these videos. It looks like you're doing them from maybe the seat of your rig that you drive, where you're
Mm-hmm.
talking about the scriptures. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm literally sitting. I'm sitting on my bunk in a Freightliner Cascadia. I'm not even in the driver's seat. I'm sitting on my bed, and I
Wow.
have this little slide out desk that kind of pops out where I do my paperwork, and I just
Uh-huh.
set the tripod and phone up on that, and that's the cockpit.
Oh, brother, it's been good. I've enjoyed. I haven't watched every single one of them, but I've watched quite a few, too many to number. And you piqued my interest the other day. I shared one on my wall about Passover and circumcision, and that's can be a hot topic with some people, especially physical circumcision and
Mm-hmm.
all that's related in that. But um, you do keep the Passover. You mentioned earlier that you bare bones it from Exodus 12. That's kind of how we do it. When people ask me initially, Brother Matthew, how do I keep the Passover? The first thing I always tell them is take some time tonight, open up your Bible to Exodus chapter 12, and slowly and carefully read the entire chapter. When you read that, you're going to see how we keep the Passover with
Mm-hmm.
our congregation. Is that kind of how you start people off?
Yeah, I mean, once you go beyond Exodus 12, you're just getting into traditions of men,
Mm,
which a tradition isn't necessarily wrong per se, just because it's a tradition. It depends on where it comes from. Does it conflict with Yahweh's commandments? Um, but we know that like with so many other things, like with the Passover Seder that's done traditionally, it's got elements, and I'm talking about like, when you have the salt water and the egg and like all that stuff, you can track some of that back to ancient paganism.
Mm,
And so that leaven of paganism has worked its way into Judaism just as much as it has mainstream Christianity. I mean, we have to be so careful when we go looking after what man has interpreted, and that's why
hmm
I like going right to the source. What does it say in Exodus 12? Let's just keep
yeah.
it simple, saints. KISS. Keep it simple, saints. Um,
Yeah.
but I mean, and when you do Exodus 12, it really is. It's freeing because you don't have to worry about like, am I doing it right? Am I crossing my T's and dotting my I's correctly? And no, it's just you eat the lamb, you've got the bitter
Yeah.
herbs, and you've got your unleavened bread.
Yeah.
Easy peasy, like
I hear you, brother. I hear you, brother.
yeah.
We're the same way. We're the same way. So you mentioned earlier how that you shoes on your feet, which we do,
Mhm.
staff in your hand. I do that as well as the head of my house. Loins girded or belt on the waist. We make sure it's like ready for travel, basically, is what it's saying. Let's talk briefly before we get into the aspect of physical circumcision at the latter portion of Exodus 12, the lamb. Now, this is an extremely hot topic, but since 1998 was my first Passover, and I remember helping my father-in-law and a friend of his. We slaughtered an actual lamb for our Passover. The Passover lamb is not a sacrifice for sin. Uh, we didn't think when we were slaughtering that lamb that it added anything to the atonement that is available through Yeshua. That has nothing to do with it. We look at it as what the scriptures would refer to as a peace or fellowship offering, which was something that was slaughtered and eaten between worshipers of Yahweh. So it promoted shalom or fellowship between the worshipers of Yahweh. Um, and some people call it a sacrifice, and in one sense of the word, the Hebrew I think is zebach. I don't have a problem with sacrifice and something having to lose its life, um, but we do slaughter an actual year-old lamb for Passover, and I think that you do as well. I don't want to assume, but I think you do.
We did for the first time last year.
Oh, okay,
Up
okay,
until that point, yeah, because I mean, there's two schools of thought. Some people will be like, okay, it says to eat lamb, so let's eat lamb. So you go down to the grocery store, you'll get a leg of lamb, put it in the oven. That's what we've done for the longest time. We would just do a leg of lamb and do it that way. You've got the other school of thought that's like, well, Messiah is our Passover lamb. So
sure.
therefore we're not supposed to eat lamb anymore. So they'll do turkey or chicken or beef or whatever. And
Yeah,
I disagree with that, and maybe we can unpack that in a minute. But like, if you're going to eat lamb, you might as well just do it yourself, because somebody is butchering that lamb somewhere in the world. You don't
yes,
know if it's a yearling. You don't know if it was clean killed. You have no idea. You don't know if it was
yes,
even healthy. And so, by picking the lamb yourself and by actually killing it yourself, you guarantee that it is an appropriate lamb for the ordinance.
hmm
And
hmm
so us and another family, we did that for the very first time last year. I think they had done it once or twice with other families prior, but it was our first time. And
hmm
I mean, we were talking about like the types and shadows earlier, like doing it, you really understand, like when you kill that lamb, when you slit its throat and it's dying in your arms and it's
yeah,
not opening its mouth. And
hmm
you're seeing all this imagery from Isaiah, and you're just living it right there. It's just, yeah, I'm getting chills like talking about it right now. It just brings the whole
yeah.
thing into focus. Just because the shadow leads to the substance doesn't mean the shadow is irrelevant. Like,
I mean, I mean,
like if I tell people all the time, if you walk in the light like we're supposed to, you'll see the object and the shadow. You'll see both. If
yes.
you're in the
Mm,
light. And so he gives us these things, and we even see it in Ezekiel's temple, in the latter part of Ezekiel. There's Passover going on in the context, and I know there's debate on, is that the millennium, like, is it what
sure,
is it, but either
sure.
way, I mean, like, it's so serious that even in the context of Ezekiel's temple,
Yeah,
Passover is still a relevant thing. So last year was the first time we did it. We actually did the lamb ourselves, and of course, I got some advice from you on how to go through that, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
We're gonna learn from our mistakes last year because it was a little bit rough the first time, and we're gonna try to do it better this year. But that's all you can do, is just keep doing better.
No, that's good. I'm glad that you walked into that as you saw that light there. So we know this first Passover was in Egypt, so it's in a foreign land. We know in Numbers 9 they kept Passover in the wilderness. They weren't in the promised land. And
Mm-hmm.
we know in Joshua 5 they kept Passover in the plains of Gilgal before they conquered the land of Canaan there, under the leadership of Joshua. So these Passovers that are being kept without being in the promised land, without any established theonomy or theocracy or anything like that, I think are very similar to the Passovers that we're keeping now. As Deuteronomy 30 tells us, that when we're driven away to these foreign lands and we begin to keep the commandments and Yahweh sees it, he starts restoration.
Yep.
So obviously, if we were at rest in the physical promised land, under a theocracy, then I wouldn't keep Passover by myself at my home. I would go to the local central location that Yahweh put His name, and I do it as a civil body politic or a government under Yahweh. I have no problem with that, like Deuteronomy 16 says. But right now we're not there, and so we kind of revert back to the familial Passovers, in the Torah, in Exodus, Numbers, and Joshua there.
Yeah, well, when you look at that too, I mean, you have the commandment, with the sacrifices in general, you're supposed to do this in the place where Yahweh chooses to place His name,
Hmm.
and at one point that was Jerusalem. Of course, before Jerusalem, it was Shiloh,
Correct.
where the tabernacle was. And so it's like, and I think, I want to say it's Ezekiel or Jeremiah, there's a scripture that talks about Him removing His name from Jerusalem.
Hmm.
And of
Hmm.
course,
Hmm.
he's not talking about his literal name, Yod He Wahe. He's talking about his authority. He's talking about that being the central hub of his worship. And so, my thought on it is like, in my house, we honor his name. We revere his name. His name is here. We submit to his authority. And so, while we don't have a tabernacle or a temple or a Levitical priesthood or anything functioning here, I mean, you mentioned this earlier. I mean, Passover existed as an ordinance before the Levites were even a priesthood. So
Mm.
it's like, I mean, you had Levites, but then he makes the covenant with the Levites, pretty much after the
I
golden calf,
understand.
So, I mean, it's in circumcision is the same thing. Circumcision goes way back before the whole Levitical system. So to say that like the whole thing hinges on having Levites in a tabernacle or a temple in Jerusalem, and if that's not on the table, then none of it's on the table.
Yeah.
I don't know. I like the idea of the Father, being smart enough to know that we were going to go into exile because of our sins, because of our backsliding, and even when we
Yes.
go into exile, He's still going to find a way to be with us, and it's not
Yes.
dependent on.
Mm.
And this is what Hebrews tells us, like it's not about the temple or the tabernacle. It's about who the high priest is,
Yes.
ultimately. That's
Yes.
where it's at. And when we do these things, these Passovers and these other ordinances, we're ultimately submitting to the authority of the high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Um,
Yes.
that's a whole thing, but I don't want to side rail it on that. But
No, no,
anyway,
that's good. I appreciate the commentary. So Passover, I see Passover as the covenant meal, and I assume
mhm,
that you see it as well.
yep,
So that when you covenant with Yahweh, this is just not a regular meal. This is a meal where you're basically telling Yahweh, I'm going to keep your commandments. This is going to be how my life is conducted, basically for the rest of my days. So I tell people that this is serious. I think people can eat Passover, and not, realize the seriousness of it. But you try to get that across to the people, and that has a lot to do with the physical circumcision at the end of Exodus chapter 12. And it's not just like, for example, you've got grown men now in the United States that are physically circumcised, but yet they're heathen pagans, right? They don't serve
mhm,
Yahweh at all. And so it's not saying that you can just have that mark of physical circumcision and be in covenant with Yahweh, but it was a point in the ancient world whereby somebody joined themselves to the people of Israel and said, we're going to follow the mighty one. that you guys follow. So it was a mark, it was a symbol, kind of like, you know, the rainbow or a wedding ring, maybe. It's a symbol of somebody's dedication to another. So let's talk about physical circumcision because it mentions it at the end of Exodus 12, I think verses 43 through 48, and it's
Mhm.
pretty clear that an uncircumcised person is not allowed to partake of the Passovers. Unpack that a little bit for us, Brother James.
It's one of those things where, like, we have two choices on how we look at that. We can interpret it, well, three choices really. We can interpret it as only physical, only spiritual, or both. And I interpret it as both.
Mm,
Circumcision in the flesh is meant to be a sign of the covenant with Abraham. I mean, it says it right there in Genesis. And when we look at the type, it wasn't just Abraham and his sons getting circumcised. All of his servants that lived in his household had to be circumcised as well. These were not biological descendants of Abraham at all. And
right,
so the
right.
fact that people in his house have to be circumcised tells me that the expectation is that anybody in his household is also supposed to come under the covenant. It's not just
Yes,
him and his biological kin. And so
yes.
if we take that over to Passover, the whole thing, like the way I look at the covenants is, there's only one covenant. Yahweh will be our Elohim, our God, and we will be his people. And then
Hmm.
that's the crux of the covenant. That's like the I do's, a man and a woman. And then when you get into, like, the commandments, then we're talking about what does that relationship look like? How are we walking it? What are the boundaries and expectations and things like that? But
Hmm.
when we look at the covenants, Paul talks about, in Galatians, right? Because you and I read Galatians, don't we? So, like,
Yeah.
he talks about the scripture beforehand, preach the good news to Abraham,
I mean,
and we know that the good news is connected to the new covenant, that it's connected to the blood of the lamb, all of these concepts that we can understand. But if it goes back to Abraham, I mean, circumcision was right there with Abraham. And so when we
yes.
go to Passover, you are, that very first Passover, to me, it's maybe you can shed some light on it. But when I read the very
Okay.
first Passover, to me, it's ambiguous whether or not they were required to be circumcised to eat that one. But it's clear that at bare minimum, after that, circumcision
Mm,
is required. You know,
yeah.
and so, like, if a person wants to eat the Passover, what they're really doing is they're coming back, because the whole thing is about the blood of the lamb, right? And when you put the blood of the lamb over your doorpost, and we can understand in modern terms, Christianity can understand the idea of coming under the blood, right? And
Sure.
so if you take it back to Abraham, and I for me, when the light bulb went off on this one, it just blew my mind. He takes Isaac up to Mount Moriah, and he says
Mm,
Yahweh will provide a lamb. But what
mm,
did Yahweh actually provide? A
hmm.
ram. So it's
Yeah.
it's like a prophecy. And that's in the context of, like, Abraham was doing something when he goes up to offer Isaac, and Yahweh calls it off at the last second. He says,
Hmm.
because you've done this thing, because you have not withheld your only begotten son, not begotten, but your unique
Yes.
son, you
Sure.
know
Sure.
then Yahweh's going to bring in the fullness of the promise to Abraham and his descendants. And
Mm,
of course, we know that the offering of Isaac is a type of the offering of Messiah that would come later.
sure.
And so the whole thing, it points to this whole Yahweh will provide a lamb idea. And so, to me, when you keep Passover, you're submitting into that Abrahamic covenant, whether you realize it or not. And
Yeah.
part of that is circumcision, and it's just like with any covenant. When you're circumcised, blood is shed, right? And Paul
Hmm.
talks about the idea that, when you ratify a covenant, you do it with blood.
Hmm.
And we're giving up a part of our flesh. We can't give up
Hmm.
all of our flesh in the flesh, or else we'd be physically dead. But when you
Yes.
when you're circumcised in the flesh, you are giving away part of your flesh. And there
Yes.
you are. It's not a painless thing, even for an 8-year
Yeah.
old kid. I mean, that's when it's most painless. The
Mm,
father was merciful to provide a biological mechanism to make that happen.
mhm,
But you're removing part of your flesh, and to me, it's a
mhm.
symbol and a type of, putting off the fleshly man so you can walk after the spirit man. That Paul spends, I don't know how many gallons of ink he spilled trying to get us to look at that. Like, you have these
Mhm.
two natures. You have the flesh nature and you have the spirit nature, and your mind is in the middle. you know?
Mm, mm,
So to me, circumcision in the flesh is a physical way of showing that principle. We're shedding some flesh
mm.
because we're following after a spiritual promise.
Have you ever looked at it like this? In Genesis 17, I see circumcision. I agree with everything you've already said, but I see circumcision being a sign of the mercy of Yahweh and the supernatural power of Yahweh in this way. In Genesis 17, we know that's the first time that Yahweh tells Abram, who was just renamed Abraham, that he's going to bear forth a son through Sarah. And Abraham laughs and he says, I'm old. And of course, we know that it didn't happen until he was 100 years old, and Sarah was 90. And then, of course, she laughs in Genesis 18, I think it is. But then in Genesis 21, Yahweh does exactly what he told Sarah that he would do. And this is why Isaac's called the child of promise in
Mm-hmm.
Galatians chapter 4, because it wasn't through ordinary means. It's not normal for a 100-year-old and a 90-year-old to have a baby. So,
Mm-hmm.
so Yahweh tells him right there in that context to cut off the foreskin of his male member. And I see it as a sign of this child is not going to come about through your power. This child is going to come about through my power. And so circumcision was initially a sign of not the power of man, but the power of Yahweh. But by the time we get to Galatians, we see that it was kind of reversed by some in the influencer or Judaizer movement, in that it now was a sign of the power of me. Look at me. I'm saving
Mm-hmm.
myself through my circumcision. So it got
Yep.
reversed from the mercy of Yahweh to the power of man. You kind of see what I'm saying there?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we flipped it around backwards like we do with so many things. I mean, if you look at the original covenant of the circumcision, right? He gave it to Abraham when Ishmael was like 13.
Hmm.
Isaac hadn't been born yet. So Ishmael is circumcised. Ishmael's not the son of promise. So
Yeah.
Yahweh chose to do it that way for a reason, I think. I think it's to show us that, like the Pharisees, like the Jews were doing, they were putting confidence in the flesh. Well, are we going to
Right.
say that Ishmael, like where does Ishmael
Mm.
stand? His descendants are all circumcised,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like he was setting it up from day one to show us that, hey, the flesh is just supposed to be something that shows what's happening internally. And when we get into
Hmm.
the whole circumcision of the heart thing, we're internalizing the covenant. So we have an
Hmm.
external reminder of something that should be inside of us. You
Hmm.
know, it's like the tassels. When we look at our tassels, they're supposed to remind us to keep the commandments of Yahweh. Well, the
Right.
commandments of Yahweh were always supposed to be in our heart. We shouldn't
Sure.
need a reminder, but yet He's merciful, so He gives us a physical reminder anyway, because He knows
Amen.
how we
Amen.
are in the flesh. And so, when you do Passover, I think the reason why He wants all the men to be circumcised is because he is tying it back, and He tells them when he makes the old covenant, right, the Sinaitic covenant,
Hmm.
all this language about, now I'm going to bring you back to the land that I swore to your forefathers to give them forever.
Sure.
If functionally he connects the Sinaitic covenant with fulfilling the Abrahamic covenant. And
Mm.
when you look at the new covenant, it's the same thing. All this new covenant language, when you get into, Jeremiah 30, we don't read Jeremiah 30, do we? We just go right to 31:31.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it just, it's the same thing. It's to bring us back to
Yeah.
the land and fulfill the promise to Abraham,
Amen.
and
Amen.
but I mean, Galatians is yeah, Galatians just, I, I almost wish sometimes, and that some of Paul's letters we could just pull to the side, for
Yeah.
new believers, and say, hey, let's put these aside for when you're a little bit farther along, because to me, like,
Yeah.
Paul's letters are like advanced level theology, but we go
Sure.
right to
Sure.
those first, and we see him talking about circumcision in
Yeah.
Galatians,
Yeah.
and we base our whole doctrine on that at the detriment of what the whole rest of the book says,
Yeah, man.
you know?
I completely agree. I completely agree. I mean, the Torah is very plain on circumcision. Genesis 17, I think Exodus 12 we're talking about, and then Leviticus 12. It's very, very plain on it. And we know there's mercies. Even you mentioned it earlier about maybe not that very first Passover was it required, but all, Passovers to come after that. But we even know that there's mercy of Yahweh because in Joshua 5, we find that there were children, sons born in the wilderness that they didn't circumcise. And so they had to
Mm.
circumcise them. So there's like a 40-year grace period there. What about when people say, um, that, they try to use the New Testament, or basically just Paul's writings, to undermine Yahweh's command of physical circumcision. You've talked about that a little bit.
I think I would approach it from, Amos talks about Yahweh reveals nothing, does nothing unless he first reveals it to his servants, the prophets, right? Something as big as removing the requirement for physical circumcision, which is all throughout the Old Testament, that's a big deal. And so, and we don't have any prophetic buildup to it. There aren't prophets, coming out and saying, "Hey, when the Messiah eventually comes, either the Torah itself is going to be abrogated or circumcision is going to be done." We don't have any setup for it. So for one person to come along, and all of a sudden say, "Hey, by the way, guys, after the fact, now you don't have to do these things anymore that you find in your sacred scriptures." I mean, that's a big red flag to me. And I actually did the math on this a while back. It's like, people, you can't look to the law and the prophets. You can't get that info from there. You can't get it from the Gospels. There's nowhere in the red letters where there's any setup to any of this. So you go to Paul, and they always go to Galatians or maybe Hebrews, because Hebrews talks about the covenants, right? That's like just over 1% of the entire text in your Bible by page count. And you're going to let that determine, like, it's nonsensical to me, And so it's like, the Genesis should be the foundation of everything. And then, Moses comes along and builds on the foundation, and the prophets come along and they build on that foundation. But you're building on the foundation, not tearing it down and removing it. Brad Scott used to always say, the whole idea was a restoration. And what we're seeing in terms of, how theologians interpret it, it's not a restoration, it's a mutation. If the Messiah or Paul or somebody comes along and changes something, they're not fulfilling the prophetic mandate to restore. They're changing something. And, either one of them would have been condemned as a false prophet, because Deuteronomy 13 plainly says, if somebody leads you away from the Father, and it talks about idolatry, but it's also in terms of leading you away from his commandments, that's a false prophet. You stone him. And Paul was accused of some of that. We go to Acts 21. Hey, by the way, Paul, people are reading your letters, like maybe, I don't know, Galatians, and they're getting the idea in their heads that you're telling people that they don't need to be circumcised and they don't need to keep the ways of Moses. We know that's not true. We know that a person has to be circumcised to eat the Passover. But I personally don't see anything wrong with, a person who's not circumcised coming in the building, and I said this in that video, because for whosoever will, right? Yahweh doesn't want anyone to perish. And so, if somebody needs to come in and see and experience Passover, firsthand, if that's what it's going to take to bring them into the bonds of the covenant, I don't think the Father's going to deny that. But he does have standards of holiness that he expects his people to adhere to when we're going to come into that covenant. And circumcision is a big deal to him. And in our carnal minds, we don't necessarily understand why it's such a big deal to him, but that doesn't matter. It is a big deal to him. So it should be a big deal to us, know. And, Titus, in Galatians, well, Titus wasn't circumcised. He was a Gentile. What does Paul say? Even Titus wasn't compelled to be circumcised.
Right. Yeah.
Like, that word's there for a reason. We didn't make Titus get circumcised. It's open in the maybe he was circumcised of his own free will, because we don't know what the background of Galatians was. Maybe they were talking behind the scenes. Oh, Paul took Titus to Jerusalem and those Jews made him get circumcised. And maybe Paul's defending that in Galatians and saying, no, nobody compelled Titus to be circumcised. To me, that makes a lot of sense, because he had Timothy circumcised.
Yeah,
so why
Acts
have
16
Timothy
there.
circumcised? Like, we got to be consistent with how Paul's acting, or he's a hypocrite.
Titus wasn't compelled. The very next verse says, in that because of false brethren. So we have to remember the false brethren were teaching circumcision before salvation. You're not saved. You're not part of this messianic movement until you have this physical circumcision. And then we, read at the end of Galatians that those who force circumcision don't even keep the law themselves, but they compel you to be circumcised so that they can boast and say, hey, I got this guy circumcised. So that's the whole thing with Titus, why he wasn't forced to be circumcised. But at a later time, when these false brethren left and all the dust settled down and they were studying Torah, and they came upon the Torah portions about circumcision, and Titus says, "Hey, Paul, I see this. I want to eat the Passover. I'd like to be circumcised." I think Paul would say, "Okay, that's fine. This is a decision and a choice that you're making
Yep.
to take this mark, this Abrahamic mark, upon yourself." So, what I'm hearing you say in bits and pieces is that we do not teach, neither did the apostolic community teach that for Gentiles or non-Hebrews, non-Israelites coming into the Messianic faith, circumcision was not a prerequisite for the forgiveness of sins or for them to be considered part of the community.
No, not at all. I mean, and to me, with Acts 15, when they talk about, we don't want to add a yoke to these people that we can't even bear. People look
Mm-hmm.
at that as like the law, the Torah, but
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
original context was circumcision. These are grown men. If you look at Peter, James, and John and company, they were all circumcised as 8 days old, 8-day-old boys. They don't have any
Mm-hmm.
memory of what that was like. That was an act of
Mm-hmm.
mercy in the Father to institute that, like you alluded to earlier. But
Sure.
the yoke that they couldn't bear. I mean, you're talking about a grown man
Mm-hmm.
going through that's a pretty big deal. I mean, the Shechemites were laid up and incapacitated to the point to where two guys were able to come in and wipe them all out.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
a big thing. And to require somebody to go through that right out of the gate,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just, I hate to say it, but it's just dumb. It doesn't make any
Yeah.
logical sense. You got to give somebody like Titus. If we go back to Titus was circumcised in his heart before he was
Yes.
circumcised in his flesh. One doesn't
I
negate
mean.
the other.
I mean.
And so a Gentile coming in will receive the heart circumcision first. And we see this with Gentiles, being having the Spirit before they're even, really keeping the Torah. We don't know what their level of obedience was to the Torah, but the Father's still
Right.
giving him the Spirit. And
Right.
the idea is, if you read in Ezekiel 11, he gives us his so that we can keep his commandments.
Yes. Yes.
Because the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, right? So we
Yes.
need that extra push from him to override our fleshly desires to walk in his ways. The reason we
Mm-hmm.
don't want to keep the commandments is because of our flesh. It's not because the
Mm-hmm.
commandments are deficient or
Yeah.
somehow weak. The Torah was never the issue. It was always us.
I mean. I mean.
And he gives
I
us the
mean.
spirit. It gives us these windows of peace to allow us to come in where we can actually function in his kingdom ways.
Isn't Paul too so educated and intelligent to bring up Father Abraham in Galatians in these talks and these writings about circumcision? Because, like in Genesis 12, when Abram was called out from the Ur of Chaldees at 75 years old, he wasn't circumcised. And in
Right.
Genesis 15, when Yahweh promises that his descendants will be like the stars of the heaven and the sand of the sea, and Abraham believes or says he pledges loyalty to the Creator, he's justified. Genesis 15:6, and this is about 14 years before the sign of
Mm-hmm.
circumcision in Genesis 17. So Paul brings up part of the Torah, Bereshith, Genesis, to show that these from the nations that are coming into the fold, listen, we have to give them time, just like Yahweh gave Abram time to learn and to grow.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah, the Father allows for a transition period. He doesn't
yeah,
expect perfection day one. He's a
yeah,
righteous judge. He knows where we're at. And like Galatians, to me, the whole thing is basically Paul just saying, look, guys, it's not about converting to Judaism and doing all the stuff. It's about being descendants of Abraham, sons according to the
mm-hmm.
promise by faith. That's
Yes, I
Galatians
mean,
in one sentence to me, because it's really easy, and we see it in like Catholicism. It's really easy to put our faith in the rites and the sacraments and say, if we do these things, we
mm-hmm.
have salvation. We're in the door. And
Yeah, yeah,
what's your heart like?
yeah,
Doing the commandments doesn't guarantee that the inside of the cup is clean.
that's right.
You know, and so that's I think that's the whole thing. Paul talks about it in Romans. That when these Gentiles do things which are in the law, just by nature, it's righteousness to them.
Mm-hmm.
If the inside of their cup is clean, and the Father can see the inside of the cup, even if the outside of the cup isn't clean according to maybe Torah standards per se, but we would look at it in the flesh, or what the Pharisees would maybe see, the Father still knows what the inside of the cup looks like.
That's right.
you
That's
know
right.
and yeah, anyway, I just I get tired, and I know you do too. I get tired of people seeing, people using Paul to justify lawlessness, and
Yeah.
I mean, Paul would be rolling in his grave if he knew what people were And Peter even warns us about it. People are going
Yeah.
to misunderstand Paul's letters because they don't understand the rest of the scriptures. And we
Yes.
still don't
Yes.
get that. Like, let's just start with Paul, like, no, understand the rest of the scriptures first and then go to Paul. Listen to Peter. He's
Right.
warning us. And you posted something the other day that really resonated with me, you know, but Paul said in Galatians, it's like, well, but Yahweh said in Deuteronomy, or however you phrase it, it's like one does not negate the other,
Yes,
you
yes.
know?
And one came before the other. We have to remember Yahweh's revelation of his law came, so much longer before Shaul was ever converted to Yeshua and began to preach the gospel. And so you have to judge, as the Bereans did in Acts 17, what Paul writes by the Torah and not the other way around. You don't start with Paul. And so people nowadays, and I love the Apostle Paul. I love his writings. I've
Mm-hmm.
preached through the whole book of Galatians. But whenever somebody tells me now, well, but Paul said this, I let them finish and I combat, and I always say, but what about what Yahweh said here in Leviticus or in Deuteronomy? That's where our foundation is. That's where we have to start. We're not throwing away people from the nations. Like when somebody wants to join, the first thing I ask them is, well, are you circumcised? No, I don't do that. That's not how we
Yeah.
do things. Matter of fact, that doesn't even come up. We deal with
Mm-hmm.
them where they are at. And then
Yep.
as they come to Shabbat service, and we read the law of Moses every Shabbat, and then we teach a lot on the law of Moses and also on the gospel as well. We teach on the gospel as well. I've got one brother right now teaching through Acts, and then I'm
Mm-hmm.
teaching in Exodus, but we taught through Ephesians and Galatians and all of that. But as somebody learns and grows and comes to the knowledge of physical circumcision, they may ask, say, like, hey, Brother Matthew, I'm not circumcised and I'd like to be. How can I go about that? Then we can begin the process in their own choosing to take on the covenant sign, not in Matthew forcing them, not in James forcing them, but in their own choosing. I want to take on this covenant sign so that I can eat the Pesach lamb and be part of that covenant meal. I think that's beautiful. So salvation doesn't come about through the physical ritual of circumcision, but circumcision flows out of a heart that loves Yahweh and wants to be obedient as he learns and grows in the Torah.
Yep. Well, I mean, if you look at it, to take it back to Abraham, I mean, I guarantee he was circumcised in his heart before he was circumcised in his flesh.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
guarantee that the Torah was written on his heart before, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like these concepts that we think of as like exclusively spiritual, it all existed in Abraham. And then Yahweh still gives him the physical. And Abraham didn't say, I'm not getting circumcised. You already said I was, my righteousness was, my faith was reckoned to me as righteousness. I don't need to do anything, like, no,
Yeah.
Abraham still did what the Father told him to do, even though he had already been reckoned as righteous,
Hmm.
and we tend to think of everything as like a status. You're either saved or you're unsaved. You're righteous or you're unrighteous. You're this or you're that. And it's like, no, the whole thing is a process. He starts us off someplace and he's leading us somewhere, and it's
Mm-hmm.
like
Hmm.
Passover is such a big deal to me because like you are coming under the blood of the lamb. And he like
Yeah.
those Hebrews there, you know, I mean, Moses says it, when he takes him to the Red Sea, he says, be still and see the salvation of Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
Salvation in the Old Testament, go figure, right? But this is
Mm.
after they came under the blood of the Lamb. So they were literally saved by the blood of the Lamb. In the literal physical shadow picture, they were saved by the blood of the Lamb. Do
Hmm.
anything to merit that? No. They're sitting
No.
there in Egypt, and the prophets say they were just as knee deep in idolatry in Egypt as the Egyptians were. So like I don't see how Yahweh can make the shadow picture any plainer. I mean, they did nothing. Like Paul says, it's not about our own works or our own merit,
Amen.
lest anyone should
Amen.
boast. They did
Amen.
nothing. Yahweh
Right.
was looking at Abraham. He's doing all that to fulfill his word with Abraham, not because of them.
That's
But then
right.
what does he do? He could have taken them the short route right into the promised land. Like we're taught in Christianity, right? We get saved and then we just got a golden ticket to the kingdom. But
Yeah.
no, he took them through the wilderness and he tested them first. And then he took them to
Yeah.
Sinai, where he expected them to learn his righteous commandments, his holy ways. And then he's going to take them into the kingdom so that they can be good ambassadors of him. That's
Mm.
that's the salvific model to me.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it all starts at Passover. When you come under that blood, whether you're circumcised or not, that starts your journey towards the promised land, and you're going to go wilderness, and you're going to be tested.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to eventually you're going to hit Sinai at some point.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, where did Paul go when Paul hits the road to Damascus and he's got this whole thing? He goes to Sinai in Arabia for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Why would he do that? Like he's
Mm-hmm.
going in his mind, he's saying, now that I've had this revelation of the Messiah, I need to go back to where it all began, or at least, in the big picture with Sinai, and he spent some time there. I don't know if he was communing with Yahweh or what. I have no idea what he was doing there, but it's like him. He went through his time of testing too, and then he starts to preach, and then he starts to teach. And
Yeah.
even then in Galatians, he's still going back to Jerusalem to submit himself to the disciples, and
Sure. Sure.
unless he's been running in vain, right?
That's right. That's
Um,
right. That's right. In that first Passover in Egypt, you see that there were uncircumcised men, maybe from Egypt, part of the mixed multitude. You see them as being like in some of the Israelite homes. So some people, I think even during the plagues, it said that some people from Egypt feared Yahweh, and so they put their cattle up. And so some
mhm.
of these same people could have, in some way, semi-joined out of fear and been in an Israelite home and yet be uncircumcised. But the destroying angel would have passed over that home, and that person would have been saved because he was in a house that the lamb's blood was smeared on the doorpost and the lintel. That's how you see that.
That's how I interpret it. Yeah, yeah. I
Hmm.
mean, if any because he doesn't just say only the firstborn of the Hebrews that come in under the blood of the Lamb. No, he just like. So to me,
Hmm.
it's like, and we see it. I mean, it's a movie, but we see it in the Ten Commandments.
Hmm.
Moses' mom and her servants and everything. They come in with everybody, and they're listening to the wailing outside, and it's just really intense scene. And they got to, because they submitted to that, they now get to go forth with the rest of Israel. It's almost like Romans 11. It's almost like they were grafted in by faith, right?
Yeah,
And so they get to be part of the mixed multitude at Sinai. They get to hear the
sure.
voice coming down from the mountain. And like it was always, the Father always wanted it to be inclusive for everybody. It was never, it was genetic, it was racial at first, just because it was based on a handful of people like Abraham, Isaac,
Right,
and Jacob. There's no way to
right.
get around genetics and race there because it's three people. But as
Sure.
that expands, all of a sudden the race and genetics become irrelevant at that point. And it really
Yeah.
is about what we look like inside.
Covenant loyalty is more than biology. An Israelite could be, a strict heathen by the way that he practices, and he's not part of the covenant. But a non-Israelite could be devoted and be part of the covenant, even though his biology is not Israeli. Let's say somebody came to you and said, "Brother James, we heard you do Passover, and you know this brother, and he's a Messiah follower. He believes in the Messiah, but he's, let's say he's 40 or 50 years old, and he said, I wasn't circumcised as a child, but I want to be, I want to partake and be in the home when you keep Passover. So would you tell him he's more than welcome to be there? You see him as having his sins forgiven, but he just is not allowed to eat the lamb because of the ordinance in Exodus 12. Or how would you go about that?
Yeah, I would have to do that, just because you know we can't negate the actual commandments
Right,
based on where we're at spiritually. There's no setup for that. So I would
right, right,
invite
right.
that brother under the roof and say, hey, come fellowship with us, come experience this. But we have to uphold the holiness of the Father's commandments. And he said, if you're not circumcised, you can't actually eat it. Now, down the road, if you walk this long enough and you decide you want to get physically circumcised, you're welcome to eat it. Up
Hmm.
until that point, you're still welcome to fellowship with us. You're still welcome to come under the blood, so to speak. It really is a simple faith. We make it too complicated. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
just the plain text. If you're not circumcised, okay, fine. If you're with a good group of people who are loving and not judgmental, because we see a lot of this in the Torah thing. We rip
yeah,
each other apart over stuff. If you're with a
yep,
group of people who has gotten over themselves, you should be totally free to say, hey, I want to be a part of this, but I'm not circumcised. And you shouldn't have to worry about nation or guilt or shame or any of these things. It's
right.
you know like when we make it about those kinds of things over the weightier matters. And circumcision is a weighty matter, but circumcision of the heart is weightier. How am I supposed to say this brother's been circumcised in his heart, but I can't let him come under my roof and celebrate the Father's ways because he's not circumcised in his flesh?
Right.
I can't do that, you know?
Yeah, I'm with you, brother. I think Passover is so important. I have seen people be delivered, both physically and spiritually, through the Passover. I had one time in my life where I was under some type of mental bondage and grudge, and it wouldn't release. And then that year, I prayed, we kept Passover, and boom, it was like it just completely released. And I think that Passover is a special, special time of the year, and we've got it coming up. So it's not too far away.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, we're coming up on the 12th new moon in just a few days, the 12th new moon of the year. And so the following new moon will be the Aviv new moon. So I thought we got to get this, we got to get Brother James on the channel, and we got to talk about this since it's on his mind and his heart. We're not being demeaning towards, grown men who didn't grow up in a home that was Torah observant. We're just trying to honor the Father's word, but at the same time be merciful towards people who need time to grow and to learn, as we all do. Brother James and I are still learning. We're still learning and growing, and the Father is being merciful with us where we're at. We're not yet as we ought to be. We'll learn until the day we die. None of us will be as perfect and clean as the Lamb of Yahweh, Yeshua of Nazareth. That's why Yahweh sent him to us. So we're not trying to overrule that. We're not trying to overstep that. We recognize that we are saved from our sins by the grace and the mercy of the Father through the Messiah. But what do we do after that happens? We need to learn to live a life of obedience and commitment and loyalty to our Creator. So, Brother James, you got any final words to share with us before we close out?
I don't know. I'm excited. Like Passover, like you mentioned, Passover is coming up every year. I mean, it just, and I forget who I learned it from a few years ago, but somebody had, and this is easy to do, but somebody had talked about, like in the Psalms where it talks about, Yahweh's, it'll say paths of righteousness in the English usually. When you look at that word for path, it's a ditch, it's an ox, treading the threshing. He's going around a circle so often that he's just wearing a ditch in the ground. So it's cycles of righteousness, and the more you do these Moedim, these holy feasts of his, like they repeat every year. You're just like that ox, just going around in circles, and you pick up new things every single year. You pick up new understanding. Maybe you pick up revelation, but you grow. And that's why the Father has us repeat these things over and over and over and over again. And so when somebody wants to come in and start that cycle, when they want to come under his authority and really start to learn his ways, that's where, we need to be graceful to each other and acknowledge it is a cycle. It's not a once and done thing. We're all threshing that wheat together, so to speak. We're all treading that same path. And if a brother is willing to walk on that path with me, I don't really care where he's at. It's where we're going.
That's right.
If we're all going to the same place, I will walk with anybody. And I think that that's the heart of our Savior. It's yeah. Anyway, I could just keep going and going. I just if somebody's watching this and they're on the fence about keeping Passover, it is so simple. Lamb, bitter herbs. We eat arugula. I know there's debate on, like, because we did the horseradish at one point, but then somebody that we know who is like an herbalist was like, well, technically horseradish isn't an herb, it's a root. And it's like, oh, okay. None of us like arugula. We all hate arugula, so we eat arugula,
Yeah. Parsley, dandelion greens.
Anything like that, and that's it. It really is so simple. It's like the Sabbath. The Sabbath isn't a burden. Anyway, if it's your first time and you're interested, I just, they're telling you, and if you are uncircumcised, that shouldn't stop you from participating, maybe just not eating it, but not actual, being there,
That's right.
Yeah, the Father wants everyone to join the family.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful closing thoughts. Thank you so much, Brother James, for taking time to do this with me. And I pray that it'll be a blessing to so many people, especially as we're getting ready for Passover this year. So may Yahweh bless you and your family, brother.
Yeah, you as well. Thanks for having me on. And I'm just looking forward to another feast season. It's yeah. Thanks, Brother Matthew.
Hallelujah.
Thanks for having me on.